Okay, so in this demo, we are going to look at how to modify color through using Photoshop layers and masking. And for this demo, you'll be able to walk through the same techniques with the exact same images in the folder that I've provided to you. But for your own work and your own technical exercise, you're going to want to pick one image, which is either graphical or illustrative, and you are going to modify the entire color palette of your own image. Now, we want to pick something that has a lot of different colors, that's not too simplistic of an image so that there's actually some room to work. But again, it does not have to be the greatest work of art you've ever created, ever. So let me show you an example in our technical exercises checklist here. Here you can see this student has chosen one image, which, the image on the right, which has a really nice warm colored tone to it, and she has gone through and changed and modified all of the different colors in that original palette, but it still looks interesting and believable. Now, your version can be as outlandish or ridiculous as you'd like as far as where you push color and how extreme that you make it, but you can also do it in a really nuanced way like this example. So let's get started on color modification in Photoshop. I have my demo image 1 pulled up right now, and these are some hanging garments on a rack. We have some really beautiful textures and vibrant colors here, so I thought this would be a good starting point for us. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of analyze this image. So if I were working with this for the technical exercise that you're actually turning in, I'm thinking to myself, well, I need to modify the color of this pink shirt, this orange shirt, this yellow shirt, this orange shirt, maybe the color of this gray vest over here, and the color of these poles and hangers and whatnot. So the first thing I'm going to start off with is our magnetic lasso tool. So I'm going to pop over here or hit L and kind of zoom in. There we go. To get a nice close-up view of what's going on. So I'm going to let the magnetic lasso do the work of getting my selection fairly close when it comes to grabbing this coral colored vest. And I always have the fallback option of quick mask mode to tighten that up, or I can utilize my layer masks. So always kind of depends on the day how patient I am in that initial selection process, if I'm going to actually, go slowly and let it connect, or if I'm going to go fast and make a lot of mistakes. But I know that it'll be pretty easy to grab some of this back from this side and go kind of attaching on here. Hopefully I can get this part over here as well, but I might have to do a little bit of cleanup after the fact in order to grab the rest of the coral. There we go. So now here's my selection. So far so good. Before I modify it, I'm actually going to go ahead and feather the outside of that. So select Modify Feather. 2 pixels or 3 pixels is probably totally fine. And then I'm going to come over to my quick mask mode, or I can hit Q, grab my brush tool, and brush in some of those areas that maybe I missed that I want to make sure that I have as a part of that selection. So I'm going to take a few minutes to grab that. You're noticing too probably that many of these tools and tasks are somewhat repetitive, and that's the great thing about learning a new software. Once you kind of start understanding the building blocks, you have the opportunity to really move forward, because a lot of what you're going to be doing is is work that essentially has to happen over and over and over again. So you get really familiar with the tools, the ability to modify them relatively quickly. And the great thing about Adobe programs is that many of these tools cross over. So when we start getting into Illustrator next week, you'll probably notice that many of your keyboard shortcuts are very similar. All right, so that's close enough for me. I'm going to hit the Q button to pop out of quick mask mode. I've already feathered the edge. I know that I used a pretty soft brush here at 68%. I can save this as the orange vest layer selection if I want to as well, but I feel pretty confident in my work. So I'm going to go ahead and bounce over to my adjustments. And the adjustments panel are essentially straight up layer masks that you can add to any given layer, or have it be ideally its own standalone layer that you can modify in a non-destructive way. And I know that I want to drastically change the color of this vest here, so I'm going to add a Hue Saturation adjustment layer. And that is going to populate here right on top of my background layer. And you'll notice with the layer thumbnail here, it is all black except for my selected area. So essentially what that thumbnail is telling us, that everything that's going on here in this layer is going to only be affecting my orange vest selection. If I go back to the background, I can keep making changes, whatever, but I know that my Hue Saturation layer is still there. The great thing about once you start making these adjustment layers is that they kind of remember your selection for you. So if you hold down your Command button on a Mac computer or your Control button on a PC, and you click directly on this layer thumbnail, boom, that selection is back. Now, is there anything in this layer or anything happening in this layer if I were to copy it and paste it onto another document? No. I would have to utilize the copy merged because I know that all the information here is actually located in my background layer. This is just the mask sitting on top of it. This is just the makeup sitting on top of the bare skin here. But I have the opportunity to modify it. So if I come back over to Hue Saturation, what I'm going to find is anything that I'm modifying is in this little tab that looks like a half moon or something. And I can modify the hue, saturation, the lightness of any given area. And I can make those changes happen to either the master, just the reds that are included in that, just the yellows, the greens, cyans, blues, or magentas. I can pick what color channel these modifications are going to affect. If I slide around the hue, I know that I'm on blue and it's giving me crazy greens and stuff and yellows. I can slide it over to the pink. It's not actually aligned with the color here, and that's because it's dealing with an interesting algorithm of layering a color but also paying attention to the total value range of the initial, like what's underneath it. But interestingly, you're going to find that as you move this around, the colors that look more normal or natural are the ones that are a little bit closer to your source. So for a warm tone like the orange coral color that we started with, more of the warmer tones like pinks, reds, yellows are going to look probably more appropriate here. But if I want, I can go all the way to blue, which is pretty cool. I can also saturate that color. You're going to notice you'll have some image degradation if you pull this too far one direction or another. It's going to be out of gamut if you were to print it because those blues don't exist as a pink color. They're very, very digitized. You can also desaturate it to a gray and eliminate all of the color saturation from there. I can also adjust the lightness of that layer utilizing the lightness slider here. And that's going to pull the tonal range up or down based on the effect that I'm going for here. All right, cool. Doorbell rang in the middle of that, so I got a little bit distracted. I think some of my hot pepper seeds have arrived in the mail, which is very exciting. So I'm going to turn that back to 0. I don't really want to modify that. My hue, I can keep playing with that. I can modify saturation. And what I would encourage you to do is experiment with, try all of the extremes of these tools and sliders so you actually know what they do. And then you can always bounce back and sort of pick that middle range or that middle tone that makes sense. If I hit Command D to deselect this vest here, I'm noticing that I did miss some of the areas that I should have included in my total selection of this orange vest, like looking in particular over here. The great thing about my layer mask is that I can always click on that, zoom in, and just like with the quick mask mode or any layer mask, I can grab that brush tool and, oops, Command Z, I want to hit X so that I can invert what I'm putting on, and I can paint in more of that nice purple color wherever I want, which is great. I could get very, very detailed here if I wanted to. Grab all of these little sections. Cool. So that is very different color. Here we go. All right, so let's do another thing with the hue saturation layer that's important to show you guys. I'm going to add another one, again, and I can even title this one Hue Saturation for Orange Vest, so I know what I've actually, done so far, and keep that organized. I'm just going to add a blanket hue saturation layer to the whole thing, and you're going to notice this one looks a little bit different. It's all white, which means I can kind of mask out in black what I don't want, for example. But instead of having it affect the whole thing, let's try to target just the yellows in this shirt right here. So I'm actually going to go to yellows, and my hue saturation layer is going to target yellows. Let's see if this actually works. If I, oh yeah, pull this over, you're noticing it's getting both the yellow shirt, but it's also getting the bars here. And this is really interesting because if you're thinking about, how do people make Instagram filters? How do people modify the colors so much so that they have their personality and their persona and their brand? Why is their Instagram feed like totally pink or totally purple? Well, many of the filters that people are building in Lightroom and Photoshop and the algorithms that Instagram uses in their own filters have a lot to do with modifications of hues and privileging certain colors over others. So right now, again, I'm just affecting the hue of yellows, and I'm pulling this slider around, and I could land it here. Now, if I only want this shirt, of course, to be the thing that it's affecting, what I'm going to do, and definitely write this one down, it's a really, really helpful one to remember, is Shift F5. Shift F5 while I'm on this layer. I'm going to say fill contents black. That's what I want because I want to cover this entire mask so none of it is showing through. Right, so full mask on. The mask has been completely taken out. So what I can do now is if I grab my brush tool while I'm on this layer mask, is I could, if I'm super careful, brush in all of the area that I do want this to affect. So essentially the entire shirt. And I can even be kind of messy here because I know that there are no yellows selected in my purple, so that makes things a little bit easier. I don't have to be quite as specific. The thing I definitely want to avoid though are those hangers, because the hangers definitely have some yellow tones in them that are picking up the effects of this hue saturation. Awesome. And then I can just brush this one in as well with that, thanks to that Shift F5. Cool. And there's a tiny bit over here. I want to make sure that I grab that too. Great. So I really and truly painted this yellow shirt so it's almost the same color as this one over here. Okay, so next thing that's important to mention here, let's come back to our orange vest, and I'm just going to grab my layer thumbnail here so I can kind of see what I've done. The one thing I do want to show you is the difference between just modifying hue, saturation, lightness, and then the difference if you hit the Colorize tool. Whoa. When I hit the Colorize tool, or the Colorize checkbox, I should say, when I pulled the hue over, you're going to notice, you know, I was a little bit messy over here with my other selection, so that's going to show up. So I might have to go back and clean that up. But it is applying universally the given color that's on that hue saturation slider. So it's a little bit of a different algorithm, and it might work for some things better than others. But that checkbox can really sort of change the scope of opportunity that you have with a given thing. I find that keeping the Colorize box unchecked and finding a hue that still looks believable and natural tends to be the better way to go. But if you are trying to get you know, a pretty different color represented than what's already there, that Colorize checkbox can be really, really helpful for that. So that is your hue saturation way of modifying color. Let's bounce back over to our adjustment layers. You're going to notice that there's a lot of different tabs and possibilities here, most of which are affecting the levels of your whites, your darks, your midtones in various different ways. But they all operate in the same way as these, where you can apply them as layers. So let's actually go to a different image for the next one here. Let's actually bounce over to the color modification demo image 1. So I'm going to show you some pretty interesting things you can do with some of your other layers. Let's say we want to darken like the couch area because it's a little bit bright. There's a lot of highlights going on in this image. My favorite sort of photographic tool for this is the curves tool. I'm going to click this. This is really your most powerful pixel pushing tool in Photoshop. And if I grab the middle of my curves layer, I can pull up the total exposure without it being like a slider, which just makes everything brighter. This is kind of attending to both your lights, your darks, and your midtones. And I can also pull this down and kind of darken things. If I pull it down just a smidge here, the whole image is darker, but the couch is actually maybe more at the volume that I want it to be. I'm going to hit Shift F5. Again, if you haven't written this one down or tried it, I'm going to fill that adjustment layer with black, grab my brush tool, make sure that it is super soft because I don't want anyone to realize that I'm doing this. And what's great about this is I can actually use that layer as a sort of burn tool, a burn or a dodge tool, without using the burn dodge tool because they are not nearly as sophisticated as the curves tool. I can burn in some of the highlights on these pillows if I wanted to. This is before, very, very bright, and this is after, which is pretty cool. Another thing that is awesome about adjustment layers is, I'm actually going to toss this in the trash for the next thing that I'm going to show you. The awesome thing about adjustment layers is that you can apply them as a gradient as well. So you see how it's a lot darker up at the top of the image, and then sort of how the window light is coming in, it's quite a bit lighter over here, and these little puff pillows are collecting some of the lightness from the window. This is a really fun event to photograph. Great, awesome tropical theme. I am going to grab my curves layer, and for this one I'm actually going to pull it up. I'm going to pull it up, and what I'm also going to do is pull in, if you see this little tiny guy on my dark pixels, I'm going to pull that in just a tiny bit to bring in some of my dark blacks, bringing in my black point here. If you haven't taken a photo class or you don't know entirely what I'm talking about when I'm dropping some of these terms, don't worry about it for our purposes right now. It is all good. Just know that these are your dark pixels, these are your light pixels, and your curves adjustment layer, you can pull it up to make it brighter in a good way, or pull it down to make it a little darker in a good way. So once I have that applied, if I really only want to make this area a bit lighter, I can actually utilize my gradient tool over here to make that happen. The gradient tool is G. So if I click that, check this out. I'm going to draw a line just like that, see what happens. Anything? Nope, not yet. What if I click on my layer mask? Still nothing. So I'm noticing up here, I have it going from white to transparent, and I think what I need is my foreground to background, which would make a little bit more sense if I'm utilizing a layer mask. So you want to make sure it's going white to black. Now let's see if that works. Aha! Check this out. If I come over to my layer mask over here, I'm noticing that my lights have been applied to the top to lighten up some of the balloons right there, but not to the bottom because I already knew that that was a pretty bright area. What's great about the gradient tool, especially when you have it set to your foreground and your background color up there, just like what we utilize with the quick mask mode, is that I can constantly go back and modify it to be exactly what I need, which is pretty cool. And if I wanted to, I could bounce over to my adjustment layers, grab another curves layer, and maybe bring this one down, and then apply my gradient tool to this one. So now I'm just darkening the bottom, and again I'm just pulling this little line up here, and when I hold down my Option key, I've really pretty dramatically redistributed the light here in this image. Here's another kind of fun one to keep in mind. Let's see. If I want to change the color of all of my orange balloons or all of my yellow balloons, there's a really interesting tool you can utilize to select all of them, because if I actually were going through each of these balloons, it might take a little while to sort of figure out, how it would take a long time to mask each of them out. So if I go up to select color range, and I click in this little black space given to me, and I find a certain color of balloons. I think these are the yellow ones. can also kind of change the fuzziness here, like how much or how little of that yellow it's affecting. I've actually selected everything that is this sort of yellow color range. Okay, so I'll show you what I mean. I can also get here in a pretty similar way by utilizing that hue saturation and then clicking on specifically the yellow instead of the master. But now that I have, oh, I'm still in my gradient tool. Definitely don't want that. Let's try that one more time. I need to be on my main, select color range. Cool. Now, okay. Still not selecting. So what's going on? I think I probably have to make sure that I'm on my background layer. Select color range. There we go. Aha. So you always have to be mindful if you're going to be using one of these tools, what layer you're on, and you want to make sure that you have that one selected. But you notice now I have these great selections that are covering all of the yellow areas that I was sort of talking about, with somewhat of a fuzziness to how they're going to be applied. So if I go to my hue saturation layer, you'll notice the mask comes up with all of the yellows selected. And I can slide that around and actually turn all of the yellow areas orange if I wanted to, and it looks fairly believable. Another fun one that you might see on Instagram is people desaturating their greens because our eyes are so sensitive to the color green. So that's curves and hue saturation. If I really want to change the sort of mood or tone of the piece, I could use the photo filter tool, adjustment layer, and add a warming filter, a cooling filter, and then kind of select out what I want the density of that filter to kind of be like. Again, speaking of things that are, you know, pink filtered or brown filtered on Instagram, this is an interesting way to get there as well, as you start to sort of see how much you can modify and change the color intensity, the photo intensity, warming up a space or cooling it down. And your photo filters, how they're set up in Photoshop, if you want a little bit of the technical back end of that, is they're selecting out your highlights and your shadows and pulling highlights and shadows to that range. And that's why, you know, we keep preserve luminosity checked, because if you don't, it sort of crushes all of the brightness and vibrance and luminosity, that's the best word, that are in your piece. And then what I like to do if I am using the photo filter on something to pull it one way or another is turn the opacity down and adjust it that way. You can also affect it with the density, but I find that if I'm working more quickly through my layers panel, the opacity gives me a lot speedier way to adjust that. So let's try a couple of other things. I'm actually going to select something like this album cover by Todd Turja called It's Album Time. This image is not like the hugest graphic, but it's interesting because I actually have a big swath of blue, big swath of yellow. So if I did want to work through this one somewhat quickly, something I could try doing is going into my select color range, grab his blue suit right here, turn down the fuzziness so I know it's not selecting out the table as well, hit OK. Got his whole suit selected. So now when I bounce over to my adjustments, I can adjust hue, saturation, and that is specifically affecting the blues, which is really cool. And, you know, there's the other way of doing that, which is adding an additional adjustment layer for hue saturation. Maybe this time I'll select out the reds. So this is going to affect his face. It's probably going to affect these letters over here. Yep. And I can work relatively quickly in this way if I want to. But again, these are just layer masks. So if you ever want to modify it as you're editing, of course, non-destructively, like let's say we don't want his face to be a part of it, I can grab my B for brush tool. I'm not going to fill this one in because I'm literally just going to boop, erase it out. Nice. With that brush tool. So cool. So graphical images are going to snap a lot easier. What a lot of photographers like to utilize some of these tools for, and sort of fast workflow versions of some of these ideas exist in Lightroom, which is your batch processing, fast editing, image manipulation software. We're not working with photographic images in that sense quite as much in this class. For all of my photo work, I exclusively stay in Lightroom unless I have compositing work that I need to do, and then I'll pull into Photoshop where these tools become really, really effective. But something that people have in a lot of images, whether it's a photograph of a skyline or a portrait of someone standing and it's a beautiful sky behind them, is utilizing tools like curves and hue saturation to really modify the color of the sky. So this is going to be sort of a review of the tools, but let's just walk through a few things that we talked about here. If I go to my select color range, I'm going to pick up my blues this way because it's going to give me that nice soft edge around most things. Kind of click my color picker in the middle of there. So now all my blues are selected. I'm going to grab a hue saturation. It's going to pop up on top of there. Make that blue sky, yeah, sort of a vaporwave teal or something like that. I'm going to go click on my background layer. I'm going to add another adjustment layer. This time I'm going to grab reds because I want to sort of change the color of my clouds here. Let's see. Ooh, that is too much. That is not something that you want to see, so just kind of seeing what it's affecting here. But if I saturate them a little bit more, that could be kind of fun. Too much over there. And as you're thinking about, you know, with your images that you're going to be integrated in your digital collage for your imaginary landscape, these color adjustments can really affect the overall mood or tone of your piece. So I really hope you guys apply these as you're experimenting through that process over the next week and a half or so. I'm going to go into adjustment layers. I'm going to add a curves layer. And again, I don't have to use the gradient with the curves. I just use that as an example. Like if I literally just wanted to mask it in, I could of course utilize my brush tool because it's a layer mask just like everything else. But in this instance, I do want to grab my gradient, make sure that's set to black and white. Cool. And now I have a very different sky tone. It looks a bit more sinister and creepy, but also realistic. So if you're wondering how the folks on Instagram change their skies, make them look super epic and dramatic, hopefully they're taking those pictures and it looks great, but a lot of times there's a significant amount of manipulation and editing that plays a part in that process. So I'm going to bounce over and make sure I covered everything. We talked about curves, we talked about our hue saturation layers, vibrance, photo filters, select color range, blending modes. that's one more thing you guys might want to keep in mind with this is sometimes it can be interesting to apply a blending mode specifically to something like a adjustment layer because it'll affect the way that it's operating. Like all of a sudden this hue saturation with the blues looks totally different, and now my sky looks stormy, or it looks super bright and extra vapor wavy for lack of a better term. So I can really sort of look through these and it's going to give me some interesting effects. Again, what you don't want to see, unless it's very, very intentional, and it seems intentional, is you don't want to see the artifacting or the breaking down of your pixels because they've been pushed too far in the process of being modified. At least in the technical exercise, we want to see something that looks like it is believably changed in color from one thing to another. So, right, we want to talk about blending modes, how you can affect those, the gradient tool, your hue saturation. I would encourage you, go through all of these. They're all going to do slightly different things based on, what you're utilizing. Obviously, the invert is going to be a pretty severe adjustment layer in terms of how it's applied. The vibrance, you can experiment with that. It's sort of, adjust your overall vibrance, your overall saturation. You can kind of go for a black and white image. Now, if you are doing something that's black and white and you take down the saturation, that's great. But something I would encourage you to do is also make sure you're keeping an eye on your contrast as well. Because if you do desaturate something, it's probably going to lose some of the bright whites and dark darks. So if you turn something to black and white, I'd always encourage you to push up your contrast a little bit and just add that punch of definition, just like what you would be doing if you were working in the dark room and adding a contrast filter, or working on your Instagram account and adding a contrast filter to something. Desaturating something always is thirsty for a punch of contrast to get things to come forward a bit more. Anyway, all of that being said, modifying color is a lot of fun. There's a lot of interesting opportunities here. As you're working with your selections, you're selecting things out and really modifying the mood or the idea of a given piece. So have fun, and I can't wait to see the transformation of your images from an original format to a newly colored piece for this next technical exercise, and hopefully you find these skills really important as you apply them to your imaginary landscape. Thanks, guys.